Hello once again, biology. We are here for part 4 of our notes. And last time we talked about the beginnings of cellular respiration as well as the aerobic, or the first type of respiration. In this part, we're going to be talking about the anaerobic respiration, like types of respiration, as well as fermentation. Okay? So these ones hopefully won't be as complicated as the aerobic respiration. There's, usually only one step that happens in them. And then we'll talk a little bit about the carbon cycle and how that works, as well as a little bit of extra stuff, miscellaneous stuff about ATP and ADP and stuff like that. Okay, so starting off today, anaerobic respiration, like we talked about, AN stands for not or no. And then aero stands for air or oxygen. So this is a no oxygen respiration. So we don't need oxygen to be present for this one to happen. Remember, in aerobic, we did need oxygen, even if we only needed oxygen for the last stage. Okay. All right. In this type of respiration, we still do use the electron transport chain on the cell membrane, but we use a different electron acceptor, such as sulfur. So instead of making water, hydrogen sulfide is produced instead. If you look at the word sulfur or sulfide and you think of the word sulfur, what do you think of in terms of smell? Hopefully you were thinking maybe something like volcanic areas, or even rotting eggs. So rotten eggs have sulfur in them, and so that's why they smell bad. Just because of that sulfur that's made. Okay, so anaerobic the types of respiration, we still use an electron transport chain. We just use different electron acceptors. Okay, instead of oxygen to make water, like we did in here, instead of using oxygen, we use sulfur instead. Okay, so that's the only thing with anaerobic respiration that you need to know, is that we just use something different. Okay, all right, then we have fermentation. Fermentation, we do not need oxygen to be present to go through this. For this, we cannot go through the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain, because if you remember, we need oxygen to be present for those two stages to happen. So we don't go through those. We do go through stage 1, though, through glycolysis. Okay? So instead of pyruvate made from glycolysis, it goes through either lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation. And hopefully right away you are using these words to identify two types of byproducts that we get out of them. Okay? All right. So we're going to look at lactic acid fermentation first. So what happens is we go through glycolysis through stage 1, which happens outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. Our sugar is broken down into our 2-pyruvate molecules, like it always is. But instead, in that stage after, like that half stage after glycolysis, this pyruvate is actually converted into something called lactate. We still get our 2 ATP produced from our stage 1, like we always do, for each molecule of glucose. So we're still getting some sort of ATP production, even though we can only go through stage 1. Okay? This is something that is produced during muscles when you're exercising. and you don't get a lot of oxygen. Okay? It's also made in the production of food like yogurt and cheese. Hopefully you recognize lactate in which like lactose intolerant people can't deal with lactic acid very well in their digestive system, like when they eat yogurt and cheese. Okay? So this is at the bottom there, sorry, um, is the equation that has to happen in order for lactic acid fermentation to happen. So that's the reaction that happens. We have sugar all the way over there on the left side, our C6H12O6. And then we have our reaction that turns our pyruvate into that long chain of letters there, that's CH3CHOHCOOH. That is lactic acid. And we get ATP and we get heat from that reaction as well. Okay? But in other words, what we really want to know from here is that we go through stage 1 glycolysis, we get our 2-pyruvate, and that's changed into lactate. Okay. So there you go. Pyruvate is reduced to this molecule, lactate is formed, CO2 is not released during this, and then we use fungi and bacteria to make cheeses and yogurt. Okay. All right. And then we have alcoholic fermentation, our second type. So this type of fermentation, again, happens with no oxygen present. We go through stage 1 like we always do. It happens in the cytoplasm like it always does, and it's broken down to 2-pyruvate like it always is. Instead of our pyruvate being broken down into acetyl-CoA, it is broken down instead into ethanol. We get some CO2 released during this. We have 2 ATP produced like we always do. And we use this to make beer, wine, and we also use it in bread dough to make it rise, like with yeast. So alcohol, hopefully you realize, just like beer and wine is alcohol, we use alcoholic fermentation to make these things. Okay. There's the reaction that it goes through. Obviously, my arrow should have been between these two things. Our sugar, or glucose, like always, our C6H12O6, goes through a reaction to create ethanol, which is what this is. We get some CO2, some ATP, and heat out of this. Okay? So that's alcoholic fermentation. Again, we only get 2 ATP out of this because it's only going through stage 1 glycolysis. Okay. So, in other words, sugar plus a yeast or other bacteria that goes through alcoholic fermentation, and you get that fermentation process where you get your alcohol and your CO2 out of it. Okay. We will be doing this in our class. We will be making root beer in class. So if you are at school, you'll be going through this and hopefully getting to have a taste of root beer. If you're at home, you actually can make root beer on your own at home. Just make sure that you have the stuff to do it and that you have, the stuff needed for the experiment. That I'll post later up. So if you want to do that lab, you can. So I'm going to talk about the carbon cycle real quick because this helps us understand how our environment has lived and been able to like keep life around, because we have animals and plants together and not just one or the other. So if we have carbon dioxide in the air, it gets absorbed by our plants here, by our trees and our grass and all that, and that is used to make sugar, which is stored in the plants and in the leaves, which are animals. Some of them eat it, and that's how they get their sugar. They eat that sugar, and then they use that to go through cellular respiration. And of course, we remember that they give off and breathe out CO2. Okay, and that's how that ends up in the air. Sometimes we burn plant matter in order to get heat and stuff for our homes, and so that also gives off CO2 into the air, which is then used in plants and stuff to make sugars over and over again. That's how our carbon cycle works, and that's how carbon is recycled in our in our world, so that we continually go through this recycling process of getting stuff we need from the things that we, produce as waste. And then the plants taking up that waste and making the food that we need. Plants also use the sugar that they make, because remember, if we looked back at this slide here, recognize that plants have both of these organelles in each of their cells. So plants actually make their own food to go through cellular respiration. We, as humans, have to rely on plants to make it for us to eat to go through this cellular respiration. So, yeah, that's where the carbon cycle thing comes from. Here's another picture of the carbon cycle, a little bit more detailed, where we get, us and other animals eating, plants in order to get their food. They respirate that out as carbon dioxide, and then the plants take that back up again. We also, burn stuff and do stuff in factories to make carbon dioxide too, as well as we have things like volcanoes and stuff there. We also have decomposition, or like, what do we call it, like sediment of some carbon in waste and stuff that goes into the soil too. But overall, that's what the carbon cycle is all about. Okay. As a summary of everything that happens, again, we get sunlight on our plants that take in carbon dioxide and water, and they use that in the two processes in our chloroplasts, the light dependent to make energy, like energy molecules, and then the the Calvin cycle to make the actual sugar, and we have oxygen made from the light dependent. The oxygen goes out into the air, sugars go into the mitochondria along with some oxygen, and it goes through the three stages of carbon dioxide. It goes through the three stages of cellular respiration to get broken up into carbon dioxide and water and heat. And then those things, this energy is used in the body, obviously, but the CO2 and H2O are then recycled from the waste of the mitochondria back into the chloroplast of the plants, whether, animals breathe this out, or the plant takes this and uses it again in the chloroplast. Okay. Creating this cycle over and over and over. Okay. Then I just wanted to quickly go over how energy molecules work and how they, like produce energy or like carry it. So if we remember from our chemistry unit, we talked about how bonds hold energy. So ATP and ADP, notice how similar they are. ADP, like we said, stands for adenosine diphosphate, meaning it has two phosphates, whereas ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, meaning it has three phosphates on it. So what happens is when we have ADP and we take energy, we can attach this extra phosphate onto it to make ATP. And when that gets broken down, that extra bond has energy in it. And so that energy there is used to, in the cell. So this process of tacking it on is like storing energy, and the process of picking it off like releases that energy. Okay. That's kind of how the rest of our energy molecules work too, where we're basically just taking something, slapping it on the end with a bond, and then having that bond energy be carried through in the molecule, and then when we pick that last bit off, we get energy out of it. So yeah. I have some videos at the end of this slideshow to help you review each of these pieces that we went through: our photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and then looking at ATP and our energy molecules separately. Okay, but that should do it for the remainder of the notes in this section, this chapter. And that's basically all this chapter was about the process of photosynthesis and the process of cellular respiration and how they work side by side in our world, to make that cycle thing work. Okay? But yeah, that's it. If you have questions, let me know. I'll post everything up that you need for later, especially a review. Don't forget to write down, make sure you're revisiting your notes and making little notes on your handouts if you need it, and the like. Okay? Alrighty. I'll talk to you all later. I hope you all have a great day, and yeah, bye.